Why it sucks to be a Devadasi in medieval India. You're 7 years old. Your mother dresses you in the finest outfit the household owns and leads you by the hand to the gates of a massive stone temple covered in carvings you don't understand. You're told this is the most important day of your life. You're being married, but not to a man. You're being married to a god. In a few minutes, a priest will perform a ritual binding you to this temple's deity for the rest of your life. From now on, you are a Devadasi, a servant of God. Officially, one of the most revered women in the community. In reality, the beginning of a story almost no one talks about out loud. Today, we're breaking down why being a Devadasi in medieval India was nothing like the honor it's made out to be. The Devadasi institution existed in India for centuries, especially in the southern regions, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh. Girls were dedicated to a temple usually in early childhood, often before they were capable of deciding anything for themselves. The reasons varied. Sometimes it was genuine family devotion, a wish to make a pious offering to the deity. Sometimes it was poverty. A family unable to feed a daughter or raise a dowry for a conventional marriage would give her to the temple instead, where she would, at least in theory, be cared for. Sometimes it was caste tradition, dedicating daughters to a temple passed down as a family obligation. Why it sucks to be a Devadasi in medieval India. You're 7 years old. Your mother dresses you in the finest outfit the household owns and leads you by the hand to the gates of a massive stone temple covered in carvings you don't understand. In their early years at the temple, Devadasi genuinely were dedicated to art. They were trained in classical dance, the very tradition known today around the world as Bharatanatyam, as well as singing, playing musical instruments, Sanskrit, and ritual texts. In terms of education, Devadasi often surpassed ordinary women of their era, who typically weren't permitted literacy at all. For centuries, it was Devadasi who preserved and passed down temple art that might otherwise have been lost. Without them, many classical Indian dance forms simply wouldn't have survived to the present day. But here's the trap. That education didn't exist for her own sake. It existed for the temple. Her dance, her voice, her skill belonged to the deity, and in practice often to the priests and patrons who financially supported the temple as well. Officially, Devadasi held a special, even privileged position in society. Unlike ordinary widows, they were spared the traditional humiliation of widowhood common in India. Because their husband, a god, could never die. Unlike married women, Devadasi could own certain property and pass it on as inheritance. But this very feature of their status, belonging to no single mortal man as a wife, gradually became their greatest vulnerability. Starting roughly in the late medieval period, and especially during the colonial era, the Devadasi institution began to rapidly deteriorate. In many regions, the temple's dancers and singers effectively became accessible to local patrons, aristocrats, and priests who funded the temple financially. Having no husband and being formally married to God, in practice meant having no one obligated to protect her. Children born to a Devadasi weren't considered illegitimate under Hindu law, a rare legal protection for the time. But the Devadasi herself increasingly stopped being simply a dancer and priestess, and increasingly became the kept woman of specific men, formally retaining her religious status while, in practice, losing nearly all control over her own life. By the 19th and especially the 20th century, the position of Devadasi had thoroughly worsened. British colonial authorities and later Indian reformers began viewing the Devadasi institution as a disguised form of exploitation and prostitution, and in many ways they were right about what the system had become by that point. A broad reform movement pushed to ban the dedication of Devadasi, which eventually led to legal bans across various Indian states in the 20th century. But here's the paradox. The women already dedicated to a temple often ended up in an even harder position after the ban. With no temple support, no official status, no skill applicable outside temple walls, and a stigma society attached to the entire class of women, including those who in reality had remained primarily dancers and keepers of an art form. An institution conceived as spiritual service ended up leaving behind, by the time of its disappearance, not only a magnificent cultural legacy of Indian dance, but also tens of thousands of women caught between two worlds, no longer priestesses of the old system and not yet full participants in the new one. And yet there's a genuinely bright side to this story worth stating honestly. Bharatanatyam, the dance performed today on the greatest stages in the world and taught in India's finest schools, exists precisely because Devadasi were, for centuries, its sole keepers through the hardest periods for this art form. In the 20th century, it was descendants and students of the Devadasi tradition, such as the legendary dancer Rukmini Devi Arundel, who fought to have this dance recognized with the respect and status of high art, rather than carrying the stigma reformers had tried to attach to it. The story of the Devadasi is a story of how an institution that began as a spiritual calling gradually warped under the weight of poverty, power, and a total lack of protection, and yet still managed to leave the world one of India's greatest cultural legacies, in spite of, not because of, the system that produced it. Being a Devadasi meant being married to a god no one ever saw, and depending on men she saw far too often. The dance rightfully called art today was born from lives in which the dancers themselves had almost no say of their own. If you enjoyed this video, there are more stories on the channel about what it was like to be someone completely different, in a completely different era. See you in the next one.